The flight attendant leaned close, pretending to check my boarding pass. Then she whispered so quietly that I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Pretend you're sick, and get off this plane. Right now." I stared at her. For a moment, I honestly thought she was crazy. But then our eyes met. She wasn't confused. She wasn't joking. She looked terrified. Her fingers tightened around my boarding pass. "Please," she whispered. "Trust me." Then she stepped away and greeted the next passenger with a professional smile. I stood there, completely still. 11 rows ahead, my son Eric and his wife Melissa were already in their seats. They had bought my ticket. They had packed snacks for me. They had driven me to the airport. And 2 hours earlier, Melissa had hugged me and said, "This trip is going to be good for you, Walter." Now a stranger was telling me to escape. I didn't know what she'd seen. I didn't know who she was afraid of. But something in her eyes told me I had very little time. So I made a decision. I put one hand against my chest and took a shaky breath. Then I stumbled into the aisle. I can't breathe. The cabin instantly changed. A crew member called for medical assistance. Passengers moved aside as I was helped toward the jet bridge. I kept my eyes on my son. Eric had stood up. His face looked worried at first. Then Melissa leaned toward him. She thought no one could hear her. I did. "This ruins everything." At the time, I thought she meant the vacation. I couldn't have known how important those 4 words would become. Because over the next several hours, I would begin to understand that the flight attendant hadn't simply warned me about a problem on that plane. She had interrupted something that had been planned long before I ever reached the airport. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 71 years old, retired after nearly 4 decades teaching physics in San Diego. Until that morning, I considered myself a careful man. I checked my bills. I kept copies of important documents. I questioned anything that didn't make sense. But when it came to my son, I had one blind spot. I trusted him. 8 months earlier, Eric and Melissa had moved into my house after Eric's construction business began struggling. They said they needed a few months. I gave them a room. Then another month passed. Then another. I never asked for rent. They were family. And for a while, I was happy to have them around. But gradually, small things started changing. Melissa began asking questions she had never asked before. One evening, while we were clearing the dinner table, she casually said, "Walter, if you ever had a medical emergency while traveling, who would the hospital contact?" I laughed. "Why? Planning to get rid of me?" She laughed too. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm just asking." I forgot about the conversation. At least I thought I did. Then there were other things. A bank statement that disappeared from my desk. A conversation between Eric and Melissa that stopped the instant I entered the kitchen. And one afternoon, I noticed Melissa standing beside my filing cabinet. She closed the drawer quickly when she saw me. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Nothing," she said. Her smile appeared almost instantly. Too instantly. Still, I dismissed it. That was my mistake. 3 weeks later, Eric walked into my study with a grin. "Dad, you need a vacation." I looked up from my newspaper. "That sounds expensive." "Not for you." Melissa appeared behind him. "We booked everything," she said. "Hawaii. 7 days." I stared at them. "Hawaii." Eric laughed. "You've spent your whole life working. Let us do something nice for you." I wanted to believe him. So I did. I packed my clothes. I packed my medication. And the morning of the flight, I watched my son load my suitcase into the car. He looked like the little boy who used to run through my backyard with scraped knees and a baseball glove. I didn't know that by the end of that day, I'd be questioning every memory I had of him. And I certainly didn't know why a flight attendant would risk her career to keep me off the plane. But one detail from that morning would later prove that the danger had started long before I reached the airport. The first warning. The moment the paramedics wheeled me into the airport medical room, I sat up. "I'm fine." The younger paramedic stared at me. "You just told us you couldn't breathe." "I know." I lowered my voice. I needed to get off that plane. Before he could ask another question, someone knocked on the door. Claire stepped inside. She looked completely different now. No professional smile. No calm expression. Just a woman who looked like she had been carrying a secret for too long. "Can we have a minute?" she asked the paramedics. They exchanged a glance before stepping outside. The door closed behind them. I turned toward her. "Start talking." Claire nodded. "I will. But first, you need to understand something." She pulled out her phone. "I didn't warn you because I had a feeling." She opened a note on the screen. "I noticed your daughter-in-law before you ever boarded." I frowned. "Why?" "Because she came to the crew desk twice." "Melissa." Claire nodded. "The first time, she asked what happens if an older passenger becomes medically incapacitated during a flight. I remembered Melissa asking me almost the exact same thing weeks earlier." Claire continued. "At first, I thought she was simply being cautious. Families ask strange questions all the time." She paused. "But then she came back." "What did she ask?" "She wanted to know who would be contacted if the passenger couldn't communicate. She asked whether the airline records the emergency contact. She even asked how quickly family members could access a passenger's belongings if they were taken to a hospital." My mouth went dry. "That sounds very specific." It was. Claire looked toward the closed door. "That's when I started paying attention. She didn't follow Melissa around. She didn't spy on her. She simply watched. And that was enough." "While you were boarding," Claire said, "I saw Melissa speaking to a man near the service corridor." "Who?" "I don't know his name." She opened another photograph. This time, the picture wasn't blurry. A man in his 40s stood beside a vending machine, holding a phone to his ear. I recognized him. Not from the airport. From somewhere much closer to home. I stared at the screen. "That's Daniel Voss." Claire looked surprised. "You know him?" "I've seen him at my son's office." Eric's construction company had been struggling for months. Daniel had appeared there several times, usually dressed in an expensive suit, carrying a leather folder. Eric always described him as a consultant. Nothing more. At the time, I had never cared enough to ask what kind. Now I wished I had. "What was he doing with Melissa?" I asked. "I don't know." Claire swiped to another picture. Melissa was standing near him. The white envelope was visible in her hand. "I took these because I knew I couldn't simply accuse someone based on a feeling," Claire explained. "If I was wrong, I could have destroyed an innocent family's vacation." That made sense. But there was still something I couldn't understand. "You said you heard my name." Claire nodded. "I did." "When?" "After you boarded." She described what happened. Melissa had walked back toward the service corridor. Daniel was already there. Claire had been nearby preparing drinks when she heard Melissa say, "Walter Hayes is already on board." My blood ran cold. There was no guessing. No misunderstanding. They were talking about me. Then Claire heard Daniel ask, "Are you sure the paperwork is ready?" Melissa answered, "Everything is where it should be." Claire couldn't hear the rest. Then Melissa said something that made Claire's stomach turn. "Once Walter is out of the way, Eric won't have a choice." Claire told me that was when she decided she had to do something. But she still didn't know what "out of the way" meant. Neither did I. Maybe they were talking about my finances. Maybe Eric owed someone money. Maybe Melissa was trying to protect herself from something Eric had done. There were too many possibilities. And one of them frightened me more than the others. What if Eric didn't know? What if Melissa had been making decisions behind his back? I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe it. Then the medical room door opened. Eric rushed inside. "Dad!" His face was pale. He came straight toward me. "Are you okay?" For a moment, he looked exactly like the worried son I'd known my entire life. He put his hand on my shoulder. "We thought something terrible happened." I looked at him. "Did you?" He froze. Only for a second. Then he nodded. "Of course." Behind him, Melissa entered the room. Her eyes were red. She looked genuinely shaken. "Walter, I'm so sorry." I almost believed her. Then I remembered the words I'd heard on the plane. "This ruins everything." I watched her carefully. She didn't look like someone celebrating a plan that had failed. She looked like someone terrified of losing something. But what? Money? Her marriage? Eric? Or something else entirely? Claire quietly stepped beside me. I need to show you one more thing. She opened her phone again. This wasn't another photograph. It was a message she'd received from a colleague after the flight was delayed. A name was attached to it. Daniel Voss. Underneath was a short note. Ask your passenger why this man has been appearing around his family. I looked at Eric. Then at Melissa. Then back at the name on the screen. Daniel wasn't just some consultant who occasionally visited my son's office. Someone at the airport already knew his name. And that meant whatever had started at my son's struggling company had reached much farther than my family. But I still didn't know the most important thing. Why had Daniel Voss been waiting for me before I ever boarded that plane? The photograph. I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph Claire had sent me. Daniel Voss wasn't a stranger anymore. I'd seen him before. Not at the airport. At Eric's office. Several times, actually. He was always the same. Dark jacket, expensive watch, leather folder tucked beneath one arm. Whenever I asked Eric who he was, my son gave me the same answer. Just a consultant. I had never questioned it. Back then, there had been no reason to. Eric had started his construction company more than a decade earlier, and during the better years, I'd occasionally helped him with paperwork. I wasn't involved in the business itself. I simply organized invoices and receipts when Eric got overwhelmed. That arrangement was why I still had access to an old folder containing some of his business records. I opened it that afternoon. I wasn't looking for secrets. I was looking for Daniel. The first thing I found was an invoice I'd seen before. The company listed at the top made my stomach tighten. Voss Capital Partners. I remembered that name. Months earlier, I'd seen it on a stack of papers in Eric's office. Eric had told me it was connected to one of his financing arrangements. I hadn't asked questions. Now I wished I had. I closed the folder and called Eric. He answered quickly. Dad. Who is Daniel Voss? Silence. Just long enough for me to notice. Why are you asking? Because Claire saw him at the airport. His voice changed. What did she see? Enough to make her warn me. Another pause. Then Eric said, Don't talk to Daniel. Why? I'll explain when I see you. Eric, you're scaring me. I know. That answer stopped me. He didn't sound angry. He sounded frightened. Eric arrived at my house 40 minutes later. Alone. He looked exhausted. His usual confidence was gone. I poured him coffee, but he barely touched it. How bad is it? I asked. He stared at the table. The company is in trouble. I know that. He rubbed his face. We lost the Harbor Point contract. That meant something to me. Harbor Point had been Eric's biggest project. I'd heard him talk about it for months. If that contract collapsed, I understood why he was struggling. We had already borrowed against the expected payment, he continued. When the project fell through, the debt didn't disappear. Daniel. Eric nodded. He offered financing when nobody else would. And now he wants his money back. More than that. Eric looked at me. He wants control. Control of what? The company. I sat back. Then why would he care about me? Eric's face tightened. I don't know, Dad. He looked genuinely disturbed. And that's what scares me. For the first time, I believed him. Whatever Daniel wanted from me, Eric didn't seem to understand it either. Or at least he wanted me to believe that. Before he left, I asked one final question. Does Melissa know? Eric hesitated. She knows about the debt. Does she know about Daniel? Yes. He stood. But Dad, don't assume that means she's involved in anything. I looked at him. You sound like you're defending her. I'm defending my wife. Then he walked out. I watched his car disappear down the street. For the first time, I realized something uncomfortable. I didn't know which person I trusted less. The man who was hiding something, or the people who might have been hiding it from him. That evening, Melissa called. She didn't mention Daniel. She didn't mention the airport. She simply asked whether I had eaten. Then she said, "Walter, whatever you've heard about Eric's company, please don't think we're trying to use you." I went silent. I hadn't told her I'd spoken to Eric. I hadn't mentioned the company. "Why would you say that? I know you're worried." "How?" She paused. Then her voice softened. "Eric tells me everything." Maybe that was the explanation. Maybe Eric had called her after leaving my house. But something about the timing bothered me. We changed the subject. She asked if I needed anything. She sounded sincere. And that was almost worse. Because if Melissa was hiding something, she was very good at making me feel loved. After the call, I went into my study. One of the drawers was open. I knew I'd closed it that morning. I checked inside. Nothing appeared missing. Then I noticed an old photograph lying beneath my property papers. I picked it up. My hands went cold. It showed me standing outside my house. The picture had been taken from across the street. I was carrying groceries. And behind me, near the curb, stood Daniel Voss. I stared at the date printed on the back. 14 months earlier. I checked it again. 14 months. That was nearly 6 months before Eric and Melissa had moved into my house. Before Daniel's financing. Before the Harbor Point project collapsed. Before the Hawaii trip. Before I had ever heard the name Daniel Voss. So why had he been watching my house? I turned the photograph over. There was something written beneath the date. 5 words. "Don't let Walter sign anything." My heart began pounding. Sign what? And who had written that warning? I was still trying to understand it when my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. "Hello." Silence. Then a man's voice. "Mr. Hayes." I stood completely still. "Who is this?" "You've been looking into Daniel Voss." "How do you know that?" A quiet laugh. "Because you've been looking in the wrong direction." I tightened my grip on the phone. "What do you want?" The man's voice became colder. "Ask yourself why your son suddenly needed a vacation for you." I couldn't speak. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "The plane wasn't the plan, Walter. It was the last step." The call ended. I stood alone in my study. The photograph was still in my hand. 14 months earlier. Daniel outside my house. A warning about something I was supposed to sign. And now a stranger was telling me the Hawaii flight had been planned as the final step of something much older. I looked toward the hallway. For the first time, I wondered whether someone had been preparing for this long before I ever knew there was a reason to be afraid. And if that was true, then the question wasn't why they wanted me on that plane. The question was what they needed me to do once I got there. The suitcase. I couldn't shake the stranger's final words. The plane wasn't the plan. It was the last step. If someone had been preparing something for me for 14 months, I needed to know what else they had prepared. I went straight to the garage. The place was a mess of old boxes and things I'd promised myself I'd organize someday. I started moving them aside, searching for anything I might have overlooked. Then I noticed something strange. Behind a stack of Christmas decorations was the handle of a suitcase. I stopped. I'd cleaned this garage only a few months earlier. That suitcase hadn't been there. Or at least, I was almost certain it hadn't. I pulled the boxes away. It was an ordinary black suitcase. Except for one thing. A white luggage tag was attached to the handle. My name was printed on it. Walter Hayes. I stood there for several seconds before opening it. Inside were only a few things. A folder containing copies of my driver's license and passport. An itinerary. And a small black notebook. I picked up the itinerary first. My heart dropped. The passenger name was mine. The destination was Phoenix, Arizona. The departure date had been 3 months earlier. I had never been to Phoenix. I checked the date again. Then the passport copy. Then the driver's license. Someone had prepared this using my identity. But why? I opened the notebook. Most of the pages contained short entries. Dates. Initials. Numbers. I didn't understand any of them. Then I found one page with a name I recognized. D. Voss. Beneath it was a date from 14 months earlier. And below that, W.H. Phase 4. I read it twice. Phase 4. What had happened during phases 1, 2, and 3? I turned the page. Nothing. I flipped backward. Still nothing I could understand. Then I noticed a line written in the margin. Do not let him sign before confirmation. My mouth went dry. Sign what? And who was him? I was still staring at the page when I heard the garage door open. I froze. Footsteps. Someone was walking inside. Dad. Eric. I exhaled. But when he stepped into the garage and saw the suitcase, all the color disappeared from his face. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't ask where I found it. He simply stared at it. What is that? I asked. Eric swallowed. I don't know. You recognize it? No. You just looked at it like you'd seen a ghost. He took a step closer. Dad, I swear I've never seen that suitcase. I believed him. But something about his reaction bothered me. I held up the Phoenix itinerary. Why was a ticket booked in my name? He took it from me. His eyes moved across the page. Then he looked at me. I don't know. Did Daniel do this? I don't know. Eric, stop saying you don't know. He slammed the paper onto the suitcase. I really don't know. His voice cracked. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his phone vibrated. Eric looked at the screen. Whatever he saw made him go completely still. What is it? I asked. Nothing. He locked the phone. But I had already seen the message preview. There were only 8 words. Don't let him find the old house. Eric's face had gone pale. What's the old house? He looked at me. For a second, I saw recognition in his eyes. Then he shook his head. I don't know. But this time, he said it differently. He wasn't confused. He was afraid. I stepped closer. Eric. He backed away. Dad, please. Where is this old house? He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his phone. His hand was shaking. Then, almost without thinking, he whispered, You were never supposed to remember it. He looked shocked that he'd said it aloud. I stared at him. Remember what? He didn't answer. He walked out of the garage. I followed him to the driveway. Eric! He stopped beside his car. For several seconds, he stood with his back toward me. Then he turned around. Dad, there are things about our family you were never told. What things? His eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Fear. Not for himself. For me. I can't explain it here. Then where? He looked toward the road. Tomorrow. He got into his car. Before he drove away, I noticed something. His phone was still in his hand. And on the screen was a photograph. A photograph of a house. An old house I'd never seen before. Except, I had. Not recently. Not in a dream. Somewhere buried deep in my memory. I just couldn't remember where. I went back inside and closed the garage door. The suitcase was still sitting on the floor. 14 months earlier, Daniel Voss had been watching my house. 3 months earlier, someone had prepared travel documents using my identity. And now my son was terrified that I might remember an old house. I had spent my entire life believing my family history was simple. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe there was something buried in my past that Daniel had known about long before I ever knew his name. And if the words in that notebook were correct, I wasn't waiting to discover what Daniel wanted from me. I was trying to remember what he already knew about me. The old house. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photograph on Eric's phone. An old house. A place I couldn't remember visiting. Yet something about it had felt familiar. By 7 the next morning, I was already in my car. Eric had promised to explain. He never came. No call. No message. Nothing. So I drove to the address I'd found scribbled on the back of the photograph. It was on the outskirts of town, past the newer neighborhoods and behind a row of abandoned warehouses. The road narrowed. The houses became older. Then I saw it. The house from Eric's photograph. white paint peeling from the walls, a sagging porch, one upstairs window boarded shut. I parked across the street. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. I couldn't explain the feeling that came over me. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. A faint memory. Something from decades ago. I crossed the street. The front door was locked. I walked around the side. A basement window had been broken. I hesitated. Then I climbed through. Inside, the air smelled of dust and damp wood. There was almost no furniture. An old table. A broken lamp. A few cardboard boxes. I walked deeper into the house. Then I saw something hanging on the wall. A photograph. 3 people stood in front of the house. A young woman, a teenage boy, and a man I didn't recognize. I stepped closer. The young woman looked familiar. Very familiar. I reached toward the photograph. Then I noticed the date. 1989. My heart skipped. I knew that woman. Not personally, but I'd seen her before. In an old photograph at home. She was my late wife's younger sister, Evelyn. I hadn't thought about Evelyn in years. She had disappeared from our lives after a family argument when I was in my 30s. My wife never liked talking about what happened. Whenever I asked, she'd simply say, "Some things are better left buried." I had always assumed it was an ordinary family disagreement. Now I wasn't so sure. I looked at the teenage boy standing beside Evelyn. I didn't recognize him, but there was something familiar about his face. I took a picture with my phone. Then I noticed a wooden cabinet beneath the photograph. One drawer was slightly open. Inside was a bundle of old papers. Most were damaged by moisture, but one envelope was still intact. There was no name on it, only a date, August 1989. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was unmistakably my wife's. My hands began shaking. I read the first few lines, then stopped. The letter mentioned Evelyn. It mentioned money, and it mentioned a man named Victor Voss. I stared at the name. Voss. Daniel's last name. But Daniel wasn't old enough to have been involved in something in 1989. Unless Victor was his father. I kept reading. The letter described a business deal my wife had warned Evelyn against. Something involving a property. Something that had gone wrong. Then I reached the final paragraph. My wife's handwriting became hurried. If anything happens to me, Walter must never know what happened to the property. I stopped breathing. What property? Why had my wife hidden this from me? And why had she specifically written that I must never know? A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around. Nobody. I stepped backward. Then I heard the front door slam. Someone had entered the house. I quickly folded the letter and put it in my jacket. Footsteps moved across the floor above me. I looked around for somewhere to hide. Then I noticed a second door at the back of the basement. I opened it. A narrow staircase led underground. I started down. At the bottom was a small room. And inside that room was a metal filing cabinet. The cabinet had a combination lock. 4 numbers. I tried the year from the photograph. 1989. The lock clicked. My hands went cold. Inside were folders. Property records. Bank statements. Old photographs. And one document with my wife's signature. But what stopped me wasn't the document. It was the photograph sitting on top of it. A photograph of my wife standing beside Evelyn. And behind them stood a much younger man. I knew that face. I'd seen it before. The same sharp eyes. The same narrow jaw. The same expression Daniel Voss had at the airport. Victor Voss. Daniel's father. I suddenly understood something. Daniel hadn't been watching me for 14 months because of Eric. His family had known about me for decades. But there was one question I still couldn't answer. What had my wife hidden from me about the Voss family? And why had Daniel waited all these years before coming after me? Then I heard footsteps descending the stairs. Someone was coming down. I grabbed the folder. The footsteps stopped. A voice spoke from the darkness above me. "Walter." You really should have left the past alone. I knew that voice. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Eric. And it wasn't Melissa. It was someone I had trusted for most of my life. And when that person stepped into the light, I finally understood why my wife had spent 37 years keeping one terrible secret from me. What happened there? The footsteps stopped above me. I stood in the basement holding the folder against my chest. Then someone slowly descended the stairs. One step. Then another. I couldn't see the person's face yet, but I knew the voice. Put the folder down, Walter. My stomach tightened. It was Frank, my wife's older brother. My brother-in-law for 37 years. He stepped into the dim basement light. Frank. He looked at the folder in my hands. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you. His eyes moved toward the old photograph on the wall. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been burning inside me. What happened in this house? Frank didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the photograph. Evelyn didn't leave because of a family argument. I stared at him. Then why did she leave? Because she found something. What? Frank looked at me. Something Victor Voss wanted. The name made my stomach tighten. Daniel's father. He nodded. What did Evelyn find? Records. I almost laughed. Everyone keeps saying that. What records? Financial records. Property records. Names of people who had dealings with Victor. Illegal dealings? Frank's jaw tightened. I never said that. But you think it. He didn't answer. I looked down at the folder. Then why was this property put in my name? Frank's expression changed. That was the first time I knew I'd found something he hadn't expected me to know. Your wife transferred it to you. I never knew. That was deliberate. Why? Frank looked toward the stairs. Because the less you knew, the safer you were. Safe from Victor? He nodded. But Victor died years ago. Yes. Then why is Daniel interested now? Frank didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, because Daniel started looking for this place. My heart began beating faster. When? Frank looked at the folder. About 14 months ago. The room went silent. 14 months. The same time I'd seen Daniel outside my house. The same time the photograph had been taken. I swallowed. How did he find it? I don't know. You're lying. No. Frank looked genuinely tired. I know he came here. That's all. What was he looking for? Frank's eyes moved to the old cabinet. I don't know. That answer sounded different. Not evasive. Afraid. I walked toward the photograph. Something about the room was bothering me. The smell. Damp wood. Old dust. And underneath it, a faint smell of jasmine. I stopped. My wife used jasmine perfume. She hadn't worn it in years. I closed my eyes. And suddenly, I remembered a staircase. My wife's hand holding mine. Her whisper. Don't ask questions, Walter. I opened my eyes. The basement looked exactly the same. The same narrow staircase. The same cracked wall. The same small window near the ceiling. Then another memory surfaced. My wife standing beside the wall, crying. I remembered asking her what was wrong. She had looked at me and said, if anyone ever asks you about this house, you have never been here. My chest tightened. I had forgotten. Not because it had been unimportant. Because I had spent 37 years believing it had never happened. I turned toward Frank. My wife brought me here. Frank's face went pale. You remember? Not everything. Don't force it. I need to know. He shook his head. You don't understand what she was protecting. Then tell me. I can't. Why? Frank looked at the folder. Because I don't know who else knows you're here. That frightened me more than anything he'd said. I looked down at the property document again. My name was on it. But there was something I'd missed. A small handwritten note beneath the transfer details. Not a warning. An instruction. The property is only the cover. I stared at the sentence. Frank. He stepped closer. Where did you find that? In this folder. He read it. His expression changed. What? He took the paper from my hand. For the first time, Frank looked genuinely shocked. You weren't supposed to see this. I looked at him. What's beneath the property? He folded the document. I don't know. Frank. I swear. He looked toward the photograph of Evelyn. But I know what your wife was afraid of. What? He hesitated. Then whispered. She wasn't afraid Victor would take the property. Then what? Frank looked directly into my eyes. She was afraid someone would discover what the property was being used to hide. Before I could ask another question, something crashed upstairs. Frank and I both froze. Someone was inside the house. Then we heard footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Coming toward the basement. Frank grabbed my arm. Don't move. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. A shadow appeared against the wall. Then a man's voice came from above. Walter. I knew that voice. It was Eric. But there was something wrong with the way he said my name. He sounded terrified. And then he added, Dad, you need to leave before they find you here. I looked at Frank. He was staring at Eric like he'd just heard the name of a ghost. And suddenly I realized something. Eric wasn't afraid that I had discovered the old house. He was afraid of what would happen if someone discovered what was underneath it. The letter she left behind. Eric stood beside me in the underground room. Frank remained several steps away. Neither of them spoke. I kept staring at the metal box. My wife's handwriting was still visible across the lid. Her initials. The date of her death. And beneath them, Walter must open this alone. I looked at Frank. Why did she write that? Frank swallowed. Because she knew you would eventually find it. But she died years ago. I know. Then how did she know? Frank didn't answer. I turned toward Eric. He looked just as confused. For the first time since this began, none of us seemed to have an explanation. I entered the date written on the box. The lock clicked. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside was a single envelope. My name was written across the front. Not typed. Not printed. Written by my wife. I knew her handwriting better than my own. I opened it. The first sentence made my chest tighten. Walter, if you're reading this, then the Voss family has finally found you. I stopped. Found me? Not the property. Not the house. Me. I read the sentence again. Then I continued. There are things I never told you because knowing them would have made you a target. My eyes blurred. I had spent years believing my wife had simply been protecting our family from old problems. But she had known. She had known someone might come looking for me. I looked at the date written at the top of the letter. My heart stopped. It had been written 6 months before she died. 6 months. She had been alive. She had been living beside me. Eating breakfast with me. Asking about my day. Sleeping beside me. And during all that time, she had known something was coming. Something involving the Voss family. Something she was afraid to tell me. I lowered the letter. Why didn't she tell me? Frank looked away. Maybe she thought telling you would put you in more danger. But she could have warned me. She did. I looked at him. She left this. But I didn't find it until now. Frank nodded. Maybe that was the point. I continued reading. Do not trust anyone who tells you this is about money. I froze. Money. That was exactly what I'd assumed. Eric's company. Daniel's financing. The Hawaii trip. The inheritance. I'd been looking for a financial motive. My wife had apparently known that would be the first mistake I'd make. The next line was even more unsettling. The property is not valuable because of what it is. It is valuable because of what was hidden there. I looked around the underground room. What was hidden here? Frank shook his head. I don't know. I believed him. At least this time. I read on. If Daniel Voss comes looking for you, do not tell him you remember this house. My breathing stopped. I looked at Eric. He looked terrified. Why? I whispered. The next sentence answered part of it. Because Daniel believes the person who knows the truth died with Victor. I stared at the page. Victor. Daniel's father. Someone believed a secret had died decades ago. But my wife had known it hadn't. I continued. Then I reached the final paragraph. Walter, when the time comes, you will probably think the person closest to you betrayed you. I stopped reading. My hands were shaking. Don't make that mistake until you know what they were forced to do. I looked at Eric. He looked at me. Neither of us spoke. For the first time, I wondered whether my son had been hiding things from me because he was guilty, or because someone had forced him to. I read the final line, and my heart nearly stopped. If they try to take you away from your home, remember this. The place they want you to go is not where the truth is buried. I looked at the Hawaii itinerary in my mind. A trip. A plane. A destination chosen by someone else. Maybe the purpose wasn't simply to get me off the plane. Maybe they needed to get me somewhere away from this house. Away from whatever was hidden beneath it. Away from the one place my wife had spent decades protecting. I turned the letter over. There was nothing else. Then I noticed something at the bottom of the page. A handwritten address. I read it once. Then again. My blood ran cold. It was my address. My house. The house I'd lived in for decades. The house Eric and Melissa had moved into 8 months earlier. The house I'd almost left behind when they convinced me to take that Hawaii trip. I looked at the date again. 6 months before my wife died. She had written this letter while she was still alive. She had known something was coming. She had known they might try to move me. And somehow, she had known exactly where I would be when the time came. I folded the letter slowly. Then I heard something upstairs. A door opening. Frank looked toward the staircase. Eric reached for his phone. I whispered. Someone followed us. Then my phone vibrated. One new message. No number. No name. Just a photograph. It showed my house. Taken from across the street. And beneath it were 4 words. You found it too late. I looked at Eric. Then Frank. Neither man had sent it. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. Someone had been waiting for me to open that box. The daughter she never told me about. The footsteps above us stopped. Nobody moved. I looked at the photograph in my hand. My wife. Evelyn. Victor Voss. And the young man standing beside them. I turned toward Frank. Who is he? Frank's face had gone pale. Michael Carter. The name meant nothing to me. Then Frank added quietly, your wife's first husband. I stared at the photograph. My wife's first husband was named Michael Carter? Frank nodded. She told me he died before she met you. My stomach tightened. That's what she told me too. Frank looked away. She wasn't telling you the whole truth. I felt something cold move through me. What do you mean? Frank didn't answer. I looked at Eric. He was staring at the photograph. Not confused. Not surprised. He already knew who Michael Carter was. That realization hurt more than the photograph itself. You know him. Eric looked at me. Dad. You know who Michael Carter is. He didn't answer. I stepped closer. How long? Eric swallowed. I've known the name. Since when? He looked toward Frank. Frank closed his eyes. That was enough. They had talked about this before. Without me. My own son and my wife's brother knew something about my wife's past that I had never been told. Why did she tell me Michael died? Frank finally spoke. Because she was afraid. Of Michael? No. He looked at the photograph. Of what happened after he disappeared. I stared at him. Disappeared. Frank nodded. Michael didn't die in an accident, Walter. My heart sank. What happened? We don't know. Someone must know. Frank's voice became quieter. The last person who saw him was your wife. I couldn't speak. For 37 years, I believed her first husband had died before she met me. Now I was learning that he had disappeared. And my wife had been the last person to see him. Why would she lie to me? Frank looked directly at me. Because she believed the truth would put you in danger. That's not enough. No. He looked toward the metal box. She also knew that Michael had taken something from Victor Voss. The records. Part of them. I looked at the photograph again. What did Michael take? Frank shook his head. We never found out. Then what did Daniel want? We think he was looking for the same thing. I remembered the date. 14 months earlier. Daniel had started watching my house. Not because of Eric. Because of something connected to Michael Carter. Something connected to my wife. Something that had been hidden for decades. But there was still a missing piece. How did Daniel know I had it? Frank didn't answer. I turned toward Eric. Did Daniel tell you? Eric looked down. He showed me something. What? A photograph. The one you showed me? No. He pulled out his phone. Then he opened another image. It showed a young woman. Maybe 25. Dark hair. A familiar expression. I stared at her. Who is that? Eric didn't answer. Frank did. Michael Carter's daughter. My breath caught. I looked from the photograph to Eric. You knew she existed? Eric nodded slowly. How? I found out when Daniel showed me her photograph. When? About a year ago. I felt betrayed. You knew about her for a year? I didn't know where she was. Did Mom know? Eric looked at me. I think she did. I closed my eyes. My wife. The woman I'd loved for decades. She had known about Michael. She had known about his disappearance. And apparently, she had known he had a daughter. Yet she'd never told me. Then I remembered the letter. Don't make that mistake until you know what they were forced to do. Maybe my wife hadn't been protecting herself. Maybe she'd been protecting someone else. What's her name? Eric hesitated. Then he answered. Claire. My heart stopped. Claire what? Neither of them answered. I looked at Frank. He was staring at me with an expression I couldn't understand. Tell me. Finally, Frank whispered her full name. Claire Carter. The basement seemed to tilt beneath me. Claire. The flight attendant. The woman who had leaned toward me on the plane. The woman who had whispered, "Pretend you're sick and get off right now." I stared at Eric. No. He nodded slowly. Yes. I remembered her eyes. The photographs. The way she knew my name. The way she had watched Melissa. The way she seemed to know exactly when something was wrong. Suddenly, the biggest question of the entire story changed. Claire hadn't randomly noticed me on that plane. She hadn't simply overheard a suspicious conversation. She had recognized me. She knew exactly who I was. And she had been watching the people around me for a reason. Why didn't she tell me who she was? Frank looked at the metal box. Because she wasn't sure who she could trust. And you knew. I suspected. Eric knew. He nodded. I found out before the trip. Then why didn't either of you tell me? Eric's eyes filled with tears. Because Daniel wasn't the only person looking for you. I froze. What? Eric looked toward the stairs. Claire wasn't following Daniel. Then who was she following? Eric shook his head. I don't know. Suddenly, my phone vibrated. A new message. A photograph. Claire standing outside the old house. Taken from a distance. Underneath it was a single sentence. Your wife wasn't protecting you from Daniel. I stared at the screen. Another message appeared. She was protecting Daniel from what Claire knows. I looked at Frank. He stepped backward. That's impossible. Why? Because Claire wasn't supposed to know. My blood ran cold. Know what? Frank didn't answer. Then the lights in the basement went out. Complete darkness. Eric grabbed my arm. Dad, don't move. A sound came from behind the wall. 3 slow knocks. Exactly 3. I remembered the letter. The property wasn't the secret. It was what had been hidden beneath it. And now I understood something else. My wife hadn't left that letter for me to find on an ordinary day. She had prepared it for the day when the Voss family finally came looking for me. But she had also prepared for someone else to find me first. Claire. The flight attendant who had saved my life. The daughter of the man my wife had claimed was dead. And possibly the only person alive who knew what really happened in 1989. Then a voice came through the darkness. A woman's voice. Soft. Familiar. Mr. Hayes. I knew that voice. It was Claire. And she said 6 words that changed everything. Your wife lied about why he disappeared. The truth Claire came to tell me. The basement remained completely dark. I could hear Eric breathing beside me. Frank didn't move. Then Claire spoke again. Mr. Hayes, please don't turn on the lights. Her voice was calm, but something about it made my skin crawl. Claire. Yes. You knew who I was. Silence. Then she answered. I knew who you were before you ever boarded that plane. Eric stepped toward her. How did you get in here? I've been inside this house before. That answer stunned me. When? Before your son and Melissa moved in. I looked at Eric. He looked confused. Claire continued. I was looking for something. The box. No. She paused. Someone. I felt my chest tighten. Michael. She didn't answer immediately. Then. My father. The word seemed to echo through the basement. He's alive. No. Her voice cracked. He died before I ever met him. I frowned. But Frank said he disappeared. He did. Claire took a breath. My mother told me he was dead. Later, I discovered that wasn't true. Then what happened to him? I don't know. She stepped closer. I could barely see her outline in the darkness. But I found his name in an old file connected to Victor Voss. I remembered the records. That's why Daniel was looking for you. No. Her answer came immediately. Daniel was looking for what my father left behind. I looked toward the metal box. The records. Part of them. What was the other part? Claire hesitated. The truth. I almost laughed. Everyone keeps saying that. I know. Then tell me. She finally turned on a small flashlight. Her face appeared in the beam. She looked exhausted. Not threatening. Afraid. Your wife found out what Victor had been doing in 1989. Doing what? Using properties and shell companies to hide money from people he had cheated. I stared at her. Then why was Michael involved? Because Michael discovered the records. And Evelyn? She helped him. That changed everything. My wife hadn't been Victor's accomplice. She had been trying to expose him. Then why did she lie about Michael? Claire looked at me. Because Michael disappeared after he copied the records. My throat tightened. Who took him? We don't know. Daniel. Maybe. She shook her head. But there's something you don't understand. What? Daniel wasn't the person who started this. Frank suddenly spoke. Claire. She looked at him. You knew. I knew enough. No, Claire said quietly. You knew what Evelyn wanted you to believe. Frank's face hardened. What are you saying? Claire looked at me. Your wife didn't hide the records because she was afraid Daniel would find them. She reached into her coat and pulled out an old photograph. This is why she hid them. I took it. The photograph showed Evelyn standing beside a car. Michael was in the driver's seat. And standing behind them was someone else. Someone I recognized immediately. My heart stopped. It was Frank. But the photograph was dated 1989. I looked at him. You were there. Frank said nothing. Claire whispered. And that's the part your wife never told you. I stared at the photograph. Frank had spent 37 years telling me he didn't know what happened. But he had been there. He had seen Michael. He had seen Evelyn. He had seen Victor. And suddenly, I understood why Frank had been so frightened when I opened the box. I raised the photograph. Frank. He finally looked at me. His eyes were full of regret. I didn't betray Evelyn. Then what did you do? He swallowed. I helped her. With what? Frank looked at Claire. Then back at me. With hiding the person who actually betrayed her. The basement went silent. I stared at him. Who? Frank's answer was barely a whisper. Someone you already know. And then Claire looked at Eric. Not Frank. Not me. Eric. Her expression told me something was terribly wrong. Because whatever Frank was about to reveal, my son already knew. The secret my wife died protecting. Daniel stood at the basement stairs, staring at the metal box in my hands. After all these years, he said, you finally found it. Not Evelyn led you to it. He couldn't have known about her final plan. I stepped forward. What is it? Daniel smiled. The evidence my father spent his life trying to destroy. Claire raised her phone. And the recording he never knew we had. Daniel's expression changed. She pressed play. His own voice filled the basement. Get Walter away from the property. Once he's gone, we take care of the rest. Eric closed his eyes. Daniel turned toward him. You were supposed to keep your father away from the house. Eric looked at me. I tried to stop him, Dad. You knew. I knew Daniel was threatening me. I knew about the debt. But I didn't know he wanted you dead. Claire stepped closer. Melissa didn't know either. I looked at her. Then why did she act so strangely? Because Daniel used Eric's debt to control both of them. Melissa knew something was wrong, but she didn't know the whole plan. That finally made sense. Eric hadn't deliberately led them to me. He had been the doorway Daniel forced open. Then sirens sounded outside. Daniel looked toward the basement entrance. Claire quietly said, the investigators have the recording, the financial records, the altered travel documents, and the insurance paperwork. Daniel's face went pale. The Hawaii trip hadn't been a vacation. The documents showed that someone had prepared for my death to appear accidental, and expected me never to return to the property. Police entered the basement moments later. Daniel tried to run. He didn't make it 3 steps. As they took him away, he looked at me. Your wife knew what was coming. I stared at him. Yes. She wasn't protecting you from me. He paused. She was protecting you from what happened before I ever found you. Then he was gone. I turned toward Frank. For 37 years, he had carried the weight of one terrible decision. I gave Victor the property records, he admitted. He offered me money. I was young, drowning in debt, and stupid. He looked at the floor. I spent 37 years trying to undo one decision I made in 30 minutes. Why did Evelyn trust you again? She didn't completely. He swallowed. But she knew I was the only person who understood where the evidence was hidden. That was the truth. Evelyn hadn't forgiven Frank. She had simply used the one person who could help protect what remained. Inside the box, we found one final clue. An old bank record connected to a town several hours away. Claire stared at the address. This could be my father. 3 days later, we stood outside a small house. I had spent 37 years believing Michael Carter was dead. Then the door opened. An older man stood there. He looked at Claire first, then at me. His eyes filled with tears. Walter. I couldn't speak. He whispered one word. Evelyn. That was all I needed. Michael explained everything. After disappearing in 1989, he had escaped under another identity. Years later, he married Sarah Carter and had Claire. He stayed hidden because Victor's people were still searching for him. Evelyn eventually found out he was alive. She never told me because revealing the truth could have exposed him, and me. She had carried that secret until her death. I looked at Claire. She wasn't Evelyn's daughter. She was simply Michael Carter's daughter, a woman who had spent years searching for the father she thought she had lost. And somehow, that search had brought her onto my flight. The same flight where she saved my life. I returned home that evening and stood beside Evelyn's photograph. For years, I had wondered why my wife kept so much from me. Now I finally understood. She hadn't hidden the truth because she didn't trust me. She hid it because she loved me enough to let me misunderstand her rather than risk losing me. I remembered Claire's whisper on the plane. Pretend you're sick and get off right now. 20 minutes later, my entire life had changed. But Claire hadn't simply saved me from a dangerous flight. She had led me back to the truth Evelyn had spent 37 years protecting. The property. Michael. The Voss family. The evidence. Everything had finally come full circle. I touched Evelyn's photograph. "You could have told me," I whispered. And for the first time, I didn't feel angry that she hadn't. I felt grateful. Because the woman I once thought had kept the biggest secret from me had actually spent her entire life protecting me from it. And that was the secret she died protecting.